We're going to start the afternoon with a few words from Gary Becker, who is was not only Gary's wife, but is also a dear friend of ours and also of the Chicago community, is an academic in her own right. And she just wanted to say a few words to us, so we're delighted and grateful that you're here, Giri, to talk to us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I think I know most of you, at least by sight, if not by name. And I'm not going to thank you for being here because you're here because of Gary. Everyone, you all loved him, and you've had contact with him one way or another. So I'm not going to thank you for that. What I would like to thank you for is the kind of letters and condolences and moving letters I have received from so many. And I haven't really replied to anyone because somehow I think I've lost my tongue. I'm still mourning because Gary died within a 5-day period. And his loss was so heavy on all of us, his family, the kids, on me. And it's been very hard to get back to being able to express my sorrow, and they feel the same way also. But I've really appreciated every kindness that we have all received from you, and that's all I wanted to say to you. But one thing, what Steve Levitt said reminded me of my first meeting with Gary, which was in October of 1974, when I was getting my degree that year. And the first time I went to talk to him, I was really apprehensive. I was buying something from him. I was very apprehensive because I didn't know much about Gary himself. I knew he belonged to that fascist department. and I wanted to ask him a request, but I thought, well, what can I expect from someone like him? And at first, I'd spoken to him by phone. I spoke to him by phone at first. And I said to him, I couldn't come and get the thing that I was going to buy from him. I said, could I come the end of the week? He said, no, I want to get rid of it. I said, Professor Becker, I'm just getting I'm presenting my oral defense. I really am under a lot of pressure. He said, well, I'm so sorry, that's your problem, not mine. So that was my first contact with Gary. And however, since he has disappeared, I keep thinking he'll ring the bell, he'll come in. I still haven't accepted his disappearance because, as I said, he died after an unexpected development in his health. Within 5 days, he was gone. And we thought when we came back from our last visit to the hospital in Houston, his doctor told us, Gary, you're going to live at least another 10 years. So in a way, I'm still in that state of shock. I can't believe what could have happened. So I hope this also gives you some idea of why I haven't been able to respond to anything you have communicated to me. Thank you. Please.
Okay, well, we're going to begin the afternoon session with a paper by Kevin. Where were you? Oh, there he is. Okay, by Kevin Murphy. Kevin was a very close and dear friend of Gary's, but he's also his modal co-author. So this is some work that they did together. Kevin.
Thank you very much, Eddie. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Gidi, for those kind words. I know Gary meant a lot to all of us, and I too received lots of notes from people just saying how much he meant, and I'm sure you got even more. And we all appreciate all you did to help take care of Gary, and I know he held you very dearly in his heart, and you made a huge difference in his life. Look how much you changed him from when you met him to where he was this last, I mean, a huge difference, right? I mean, that's not the Gary we all have come to know and love. And so I guess some of the revisionist history on Gary is actually correct. But anyway, this is joint work, and it's not very far along. It's work that Gary and I started a number of years ago, and like most things that we ever worked on, kind of gets laid down, picked up, and this one actually didn't get picked up for quite a while. So I'm going to talk about it today and hopefully help me think about how I'm going to put it together. It's a lot harder doing it by myself rather than with Gary, who just could always push the ball forward. So it's about the economics of persuasion and indoctrination. And Gary's interest and my interest in things like persuasion really reflects a broader interest in preferences. And there's a stereotype of the rational model is a world of very rigid people who don't make very interesting choices or care about important things. And Gary kind of showed that wasn't the case. That actually rational people can care about all kinds of things, and they also can be subject to all kinds of pressures. That people's actions. I always like to make an analogy. It's like, when I teach about people about consumption theory, you don't want to fall into thinking the restaurant business is about nutrition. That's the mistake I think people make when they do a caricature of economics. They sort of forget that, we're open to people caring about lots of stuff. So persuasion is an interesting thing, and persuasion is an important part of our economy. It does things like advertising is one of the most obvious ones. Gary and I once wrote a paper on advertising. I'll try to start with that in what I do today. More generally, promotion. You go into a store, they have salesmen and all the other people like that. Even probably at least as important or more important is things what you might call indoctrination. That is, we do many things to persuade our children's behavior. We try to teach them to do right from wrong. We try to teach them to abide by various social norms. Governments try to influence the choices of their citizens. So the idea of persuasion is an important one. And the question is, how do you model it? How do you think about persuasion? And I actually think persuasion fits very well into a rational choice framework, and I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that today. And I know Gary shared that same view, and we talked about that many times, about how you can try to build persuasion into a simple rational choice model. And I'm going to start, like I said, with the Becker-Murphy framework. And the Becker-Murphy framework was one we used to explain advertising. And the thing we did, which was pretty simple, is we just said, okay, we have a utility function, and it's defined over consumption of goods. I just thought of two goods here. You can have many goods if you want, X and Y. And then you could think of them as advertisements or whatever, AX and AY, which are things that enter utility that affect your demand for those other goods. And the idea that some goods enter utility affect demand for other goods, of course, is well known. The simple theory of complements, for example, is along those lines. So it allows for many types of persuasion. Well, you might think of A as information. It helps you learn how to use the good, what it's good for, things like that. Helps you know where to find it, all those kinds of things, all in a reduced form sense, could be put into a utility function. Also can work with association. Advertising could help you associate particular goods with other things. That is, helps define the goods. You might think, well, is that rational? Is it rational for people to make such associations? Again, an analogy I think is helpful. I mean, when you go to a scary movie and people get scared or people cry when somebody dies, you don't say to them, hey, that guy didn't really die. I saw him in the end of the movie last week. Why are you crying? That the association is something that's real. It's part of people's preferences, and that you can bring in cues. But I want to get the last one, because the last one is the one I want to talk about today, which is pressure. I want to think about a world where we can pressure people to change their choices. And people may not like pressure, and in fact, we're going to make that an important part of the problem, that people actually don't want to be pushed off of what they would otherwise want to do, and they might resist the pressure that you would put on them. And the question is, in a market context, can we think about a world, would it pay to pressure people? And I'm going to think about it in a voluntary sense, and that's this last sentence on the slide. Providers get to choose the amount of pressure or persuasion they put on, but the consumers have to be willing to accept it. They can't just force people to have it. Okay? If you want to force them to have it, think of that as a tax. I can tax people and force them to take the pressure. And some governments do that. Some governments force people to accept the pressure to do certain things or take certain actions, and I'll talk about that later. In fact, Gary and I kind of wrote a whole paper on that when we talked about illegal goods and prohibitions and the effort to force people to reduce their consumption. At the end, I'll try to come back and say why I think that model is a little different than this one, and the conclusions are actually quite different. Gary actually, when he wrote it up, and I just want to put this up because I think it to remind us of Gary, he wrote it up. He had two goods, X and Y, two types of persuasive efforts, AX, trying to get you to buy more X, AY, trying to get you more Y. Utility function, just the way I wrote it, usual positive margin utilities of X and Y, but not saying anything about the margin utilities of AX or AY. And if you're doing the very general problem, I think that's the right way to think about it. You could think about pressure or things that induce you to think of AX as things that induce you to buy more X. They're things you consume. And they could be either positive or negative from your point of view. Classic example of a negative might be I go down the street, I see a beggar. I don't like seeing beggars, but nonetheless, I give the beggar money. And so X would be my donations to the beggar. And I do more of that when I see him, even though I might avoid seeing him. And one question you think about my model, the model we're going to talk about today, is could the beggar pay me to come by? Could he pay me to walk by and see him, and then therefore induce me to give him more than I otherwise would? Same might be true if this is utility of your children, and you're putting pressure on your children to care about you when you're older, or not take drugs, or to do other things that you want them to do. They may not enjoy that pressure. They might rather not have the guilt that later enforces them to do particular actions. So I'm not going to take a stand on the sign of AX and AY, although many times I'm going to think about the net cost, at least, of being negative. So we have to compensate people rather than charge them. Obviously, if A is information, they may in fact be willing to pay for it. All right, so again, in household production language, the way we set it up is we thought about there being a simple budget constraint where X and Y are the goods you actually buy in the marketplace. But we thought that being persuaded took some time. They take away from your time budget, and that's the time constraint. And we can write that in the full income constraint as we have there. And of course, you get the usual marginal first order conditions, that the margin utility of consumption of X or Y has to be equal to margin utility of income times its associated price. Conditions for AX and AY are less clear. It depends on how you set it up. Some models you might want to say, I get to choose the level of persuasion, in which case I would go to the point where you'd have a similar condition. They would be equalities in those next two ones. If it's voluntary, though, you got to have at least positive margin utility. You can't persuade the guy more than he's willing to accept. Well, but since they don't sell persuasion, they don't collect directly on persuasion in this model, you might think that persuaders have to benefit in some way, and the way they benefit here is by shifting the demand for X and Y, and that's exactly what Gary and I did in that earlier paper. Now, what does economics tell us about persuasion? So we might want to, should we be able to persuade rational individuals? Next question you might ask is what types of persuasions should we expect to see? And finally, why compete on persuasion rather than price? I'm trying to answer all them questions. So one approach, and this is the one we did in the paper, was just think of it in simple complement sense. more AX shifts the demand for X. Gain to providing more AX can be written in two ways. One is the increase in output times the price cost margin. That would be the measure your gain, because the way you gain is you do more A, and then that gets people to buy more X. And how much do I gain? Well, it's my price cost margin. And that has the usual view of advertising, that you'll do more advertising the bigger your price cost margin is for a given increase in output. But as we pointed out in our earlier paper, there's another way to write that same condition that makes it not so clear. It depends on the price cost margin, which is you could just write it as the quantity multiplied times the change in price for a given level of advertising. And which makes perfect sense, because the gain to you is how much you shift the demand curve vertically. It's how much you shift that demand curve up. And whether it's very elastic or inelastic, you don't really care. What you really care is how much you vertically shift the curve. And therefore, even though these look like they have conflicting implications, they don't, because it just simply says if you have a lower price cost margin, then you likely have more elastic demand. And if you have more elastic demand, then a given vertical shift means a bigger horizontal shift. And so, but I'm not going to focus on that case. And this is the case that applies to many of those other models. The queuing model, I would say to the association model, to the pure complements view of the world. All those models kind of fit really well in this framework, where you just think about there being a demand curve, and that demand curve gets shifted according to the provision of whatever this other good is, because it changes the marginal value people associate with that good. They either, as they associate pretty girls with the drinking this kind of beer, that raises the marginal value, or any other mechanism you want to have, fame or whatever you have kind of associate. I want to instead focus on a case where persuasion is much more coercive. That is, persuasion is an effort to directly affect the person's choices. I'm not going to shift his demand curve. I'm going to make him do something different than he otherwise wants to do. And so I'm going to ask the question, what does it take to persuade? And this draws on some similar work that actually Ted Snyder and Bob Topel and I have done in another context, which is to look at a profit-maximizing firm who faces a downward sloping demand curve and sets a single price for consumers based on the usual marginal revenue equals marginal cost condition. So the price he charges is PL, and the quantity he sells to each consumer is QL. That's the demand curve sloping down, and the K is the marginal cost curve going across. What's important, though, is what I've drawn this. Now you're going to see my really shaky hands, but this downward sloping curve is the customer's indifference curve in price quantity space, which is actually horizontal at the equilibrium price, because at that price, every point of the demand curve crosses through the peak of these indifference curves, because that quantity maximizes utility given that price, right? That you've chosen the quantity to maximize utility. And then ask yourself, what would it cost the consumer, or what would you have to pay the consumer to move off that demand curve? And if I ask you how much I'd have to pay you to shift upward, go straight up, then it's a simple calculation. It's just what we had before. It's the change in P times X. But if I ask you how much would I have to pay you to move horizontally, that is, how much would I have to pay you to buy 10% more than you otherwise would at a given price, the answer is it's quite a small number. If the elasticity of demand is -1, and you tell me I want you to consume 10% more at a given price, then the cost to you is roughly 10% times 10% times a half, which would be like a half of 1% of expenditures. I can actually induce this person to move without really compensating him very much at all. So if I had the ability to persuade him once he came into my store, and I asked how much would I have to pay to persuade him once he got in the store, the answer is not much. I could, in fact, pay him very little and then put some pressure on him to buy this good that he otherwise wouldn't want to buy. And assume he has to succumb to that pressure, actually he would be willing. Now, it also tells us something else. he's unlikely to be very well informed about how much he really likes this good. And this ties it back to the informational theory. That is, the desire he has to pinpoint his marginal value is actually pretty low for that same reason. Consuming 10% more or 10% less is not very costly to him because it's a small difference in value times a small difference in quantity, which is small squared in terms of its difference in consumer surplus. It's not that he doesn't care whether he values the good a lot or a little. It's whether his decision is affected, right? He cares a lot whether it's a good, really good, or bad. That's first order. It doesn't vary on the square. The question is, if I know I'm going to buy the good, and it's just a question of how much, I'm going to be pretty willing to tolerate a fair level of uncertainty. So consumers are going to be relatively uninformed. They're going to be resistive to being pushed upward, but they're not going to be very resistive to being pushed sideways. And that's going to open us up to a fair amount of avenue for persuasion. And so just to review, well, how do providers benefit? They're going to benefit from changing the consumer's choice. And in my example I just gave, what they're going to gain is that price-cost margin. And this kind of gives us a clear message, though. This is why now you recover this old result about price-cost margins, because the incentive to persuade him to buy a little more is much greater the higher that price-cost margin is. And so people are going to engage in more of that. And number two, you got to compensate consumers. You're going to have to pay them somewhat. And so if you want to persuade them, you might have to give them other reasons to come to your store if you're a grocery store or any other store. If you're going to get them to persuade them by getting them to watch a commercial, you got to pay them to watch the commercial, not just to compensate for their time, but also to compensate for the fact that they may nonetheless be pushed to do something they don't want to do. But again, we got this asymmetry. Resistance to changes in quantities is going to be small. So people will be open to persuasion. I think this is actually interesting because it's tied in closely to some of the work that people have done to say that people can be pushed around in terms of their decision making. And people often take that as evidence against rational choice. And I actually think it's an implication of rational choice. At least for small changes, people should be very open to, and pretty cheap to move. And I think that's an interesting implication. And it's one of the reasons why persuasion is going to be an important part of the economy in many directions. Now, what causes the gain for the producer? Well, the producer's gain in this case comes from the fact that he's selling at a price greater than cost. And whenever you want to say the producer wants to influence my choice or somebody wants to influence my choice, you might have to ask, well, why? And in this case, you can see from the point of view of the two parties, this is an efficiency-enhancing point. The consumer values it more highly than the cost. There's a joint benefit to expanding trade between these partners. And in fact, persuasion is one way to get that expansion of trade to happen. Now, I got to compensate the consumer. That is, I can't literally move him horizontally in that picture. I got to get down into that football-shaped region or funny-looking football-shaped region. I got to get down in there, which means I have to compensate him in some way. But at least if I only want to move a little, I got to compensate him very, very little in exchange for moving horizontally like that. So I think persuasion is going to be a natural part of existence. Now, efficiency in, say, trade between a consumer and a company isn't the only dimension on which this kind of thing can work. It can also work within a family. Jorg, I know he's here, and Gary and I did a paper recently where we were looking at changes in families doing the same thing. And there, the efficiencies that were being gained were exchanges over time between parents and children. That by parents in working and investing in maybe costly to their children of indoctrinating their children and making their children guilty, say, so that they would take care of their parents when they were old, would induce parents to make more efficient choices and allow greater trade between parents and children over the lifetime. And just like that price-cost margin generates a reason why somebody be willing to pay more than they have to persuade me to move, you can get that same thing happen within a family. That is, persuasion could actually pay, partly because there's an efficiency gain to doing it. So what else can we learn from a framework like this? Well, what do we know? Well, consumers are going to choose to be relatively uninformed. We can pay for the right to persuade. Again, persuasion should be part of the equilibrium. So what institutions should we expect to see? We should see institutions that affect consumer choices, and we should see ways in which consumers get compensated for doing that. And so I want to give you what I think is a good application. Again, this builds very similarly to some of the things. Well, first off, it's going to happen most prevalently when price is greater than marginal cost, or this kind of pressure can solve some other contractual problem, because price greater than marginal cost really is a contractual problem that we couldn't efficiently find a way to price at cost. But it also may help to follow other problems, and actually can have benefits. People can actually benefit from the ability to be persuaded, and I want to try to explain that right now. So let's take the case where consumers have these preferences. They're able to be persuaded. They know they're going to be persuaded, and they demand compensation for that. And they buy their products through a store, like a grocery store or someplace else. And therefore, what they've effectively agreed to do is to delegate the store the ability to make choices for them. And their commitment device to allowing the store to make choices is this willingness to be persuaded, that it doesn't cost very much to have them move my consumption. Well, that now means I am going to be more willing to move my consumption in response to what the store does than I would be in a world where I'm right on my demand curve all the time. It's easier for the store to deliver my business to somebody. So I don't know what kind of spices I want. I'm poorly informed about what kind of spices, and the store is going to choose which brand of spices go in the store. The ability to move me as a customer and move all the other customers in that store is going to enhance that store's ability to play one spice manufacturer off against the other. And so the ability to be persuaded is actually going to influence the competition that occurs between sellers. And it actually can make sellers compete more aggressively against one another than they would otherwise. And so the fact that these institutions arise that allow people to persuade actually can be beneficial. And in fact, the ability to be persuaded actually would be, in many ways, beneficial. It's like a commitment device that when he makes the choice, all actually follow. And we would all like to commit, right? What's the way to negotiate with two sellers is to commit that if they give you the lowest price, you'll shift more business than you would really want to shift to them. And this persuadability is actually a way to accomplish that commitment. I can actually commit myself to following what was in our collective interest, because it allows us to actually negotiate better deals upstream because of the ability to move customers more than they would otherwise. I think that's really a cool thing, because we see so much things like stores doing shelf space deals or end caps or all the other. This really brings marketing to me into the realm of rational choice, that you can just use a very rational choice framework, albeit augmented with this idea that I'm not going to be perfectly informed and I have some ability to be persuaded, and use that to try to help understand why we see persuasion not just emerge. We usually think of persuasion as kind of forcing, getting people away. This is actually or reducing competition. People think of advertising as a barrier to competition. This kind of thinks of persuasion and marketing and other things as part of competition, that they emerge precisely as a as a device. And I think it would be really interesting to think about, okay, now let's take a multi-product firm like a grocery store who's now in the business of doing this not just for one product, for many products. I can now make deals on one margin and compensate you on other margins. I don't have to do it product by product. because I'm going to compete for customers on a kind of a basket of groceries level. Now, there's a couple complications that we haven't talked about that still need to be completely worked out. One is this comparison to prohibitions, because you can think of a prohibition as kind of like negative persuasion. And when Gary and I wrote a paper on market for illegal drugs, we really came out hard that prohibitions were bad, and they didn't make a lot of sense. And if you go through the economics of that, the reason is you have to, what makes it so costly is it's the opposite of what we just did. You actually have to raise the cost of every unit up till now to reduce the number of units. So the gain is this little triangle from getting less consumption, and the cost is this huge rectangle that you imposed on every unit. Now, what that means is, what happens really is you don't have good self-selection. That is, the people who you have to kind of enforce against are not just the marginal people, you have to enforce against everybody. So in order for persuasion to work, you need kind of the opposite. You need the kind of the people you persuade, and the costs that you impose on people are only kind of on those margins. If you have to kind of, if it's costly, it can work very much. It's not that it can't work, but it can work very much in the opposite direction. The other thing is, those are in-kind taxes, and in-kind taxes are very inefficient, and they're very inefficient because you're incurring costs in order to reduce consumption. In-kind subsidies, even when they're inefficient, aren't nearly as bad, because if people value the subsidy like 90 cents on the dollar, at least they're getting 90 cents rather than you costing you 90 cents. It's very much less inherently inefficient in that direction. So there are a couple things that make it different. I think it also has some very interesting vertical implications. There's often going to be disagreements between retailers and upstream providers on persuasion, what kind of persuasion they want to see, who they want to see persuaded. The benefits will often differ. You might have a big margin upstream. For example, in the cosmetics business or something, I have huge margins upstream. On the other hand, retailers may be much better suited to do the promotion for this reason I've talked about before, that they're able there with multiple products to really capture the customers. That is, get the customers based on what they provide across the whole spectrum and target the promotion. They're also, you can get the gains to trade and contracting like I just talked a little while ago. And finally, this notion that will often enhance competition between producers. So there's a little bit of disagreement between, producers like it ex ante, but ex post, after it's all said and done, they all may be worse off, but that's a common form of competition. Finally, I think what I'd like to go with this in the future is to link this up to a discussion of networks and platforms, because I think this inherently links us into those things. Because if you think about persuasion and your ability to persuade people, you might say, well, what gives me the ability to persuade? One is they may care about doing what I tell them to do. They might care about pleasing me. They might be worried that I won't do something again for them in the future. There's lots of reasons why you might have persuasion and the ability to persuade people. They might trust me to make good choices for them. And this is where I don't think persuasion and information are like completely independent. A lot of times you get some of both. So when I put a certain product on the eye-level shelf, I may be telling you this is the most popular product among people that shop in my store, and therefore it's probably a product you want. It has some information, but it also has an element of kind of persuasion in the sense that it may be pushing you to buy more than you might otherwise for other reasons. So I think thinking of that as a network, and once you've built the network to sell one product might help you build a network to sell others. I think it also, often persuasion works indirectly. That is, persuading one person can persuade other people in his social network and things like that. And there can be economies of scope in building persuasion networks. I think this is actually interesting from the point of view of political parties and things like that. You build a party because, and I begin associating with somebody because we agree on one issue, suddenly that gives a venue, and we have a gain to building a relationship where I care what you think and you care what I think, because that helps enforce us sticking together on the issue we care about. But those assets often aren't specific to that one issue. Those assets will carry over to other issues, and then I can start trying to convince you about my issue. I was talking to Bernie Monk earlier about this, and he was interested in cronyism and things like that. I think some of that has that same aspect to it, that things that can have productive efficiencies also have inefficiencies because they kind of come together as people develop the human capital to do those things. That's really what I have. It's still pretty rough and still pretty early. I think the major idea that we're trying to play on is, again, start with the old, utility maximizing framework. Think of people being rational, but think of them being rationally rational. And rationally rational means I probably am not so stuck on my choices, and I'm willing to make adjustments. And in fact, once I'm willing to make adjustments, that opens up a whole new set of things that markets can provide. And they can provide ways for manufacturers or producers to influence my choices. That generates advertising, promotion, retailing industry in lots of different ways, maybe the whole field of marketing in some ways. And at the same time, it changes competition, because competition now is subject to not just competition on price, but also competition on promotion. And that's an important part of many industries, that's how we compete. And the two tie together, because this ability to shift consumers actually can change price competition in ways that I don't think people have focused on enough up till now. All right, that's what I had to say for today.
So this is really cool. I wonder if you can use the framework at all to talk about markets in which you expect to see price competition. Settings with large discrete goods, say, like you might think that it's really hard to get people are on the margin with regards to spices, but maybe not with regards to Ferraris or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you really have to think about one thing. One is, the costs of how close I am to the margin, and how many people are close to the margin. Number two, how easy it is to target this pressure on the marginal customers, because the less you're able to target it to the marginal customers, the more costly it's going to be. You're going to be back in the Prohibition world where you're incurring a cost on everybody to move a few people, and that's the inefficiency associated with it. So I think that would be a very good example. Another good example is you're more likely to see it in cases where there's the potential for upstream competition when in fact there's not that much upstream competition. That is, we're in a world with relatively high price cost margins, even though there's a potential, this is like in the old exclusive dealing stuff. We'd have big incentive to kind of negotiate for exclusives, and those exclusives could be more efficient when people are more willing to go along, because it's optimal. It's like I won't want to be on my demand curve. I'd love to be able to commit to be off my demand curve. That would really allow me to negotiate much better, right? It's like, in principle, if you could really do that effectively, you had monopolists of completely separate goods. You could say, look, I'm only going to buy from, you have 10 monopolists of 10 goods. I'm only going to buy from 9 of you guys, and whoever is the lowest price is going to get all, I'm going to buy from all 9. You could, in principle, drive them all down. Now, monopolists are not going to go for that because they know you can't commit. And this persuasion ability actually gives you somewhat of ability to commit. That's, I think, is kind of interesting.
So this looks like, to me, like a great paper to explain Groupon, both from the side of that it's incremental and that it's also, this network. But even on the demander side, it's not even price discovery of what people are, by the seller, what people will pay. It's also helping the customers get
get better
learn.
deals.
It's price. No, it's value discovery, not price discovery. It's like, do I really like your product? And so those platforms, I can see there's a lot to be done here.
Yeah, that's kind of I think that's right. I think you can do this in a world without persuasion, but I think persuasion helps. And I think thinking about persuasion adds to the ability and the applicability of these kind of these kind of indirect competition type models.
So one of the implications of the openness when costs are low, of course, is that political persuasion is going to be rampant. Since we should be, incredibly open to changing our votes in the voting booth, since it doesn't make any darn difference. So this also has the actual implication that if this is the case, that political decisions are often going to be quite crappy because you just have so much of a power of persuasion to move stuff. Another implication, which I was sort of it relates to the why persuasion and not prohibition, but it's a point that I've actually associated with, it's normally associated with George Lowenstein, which is that really effective negative persuasion, like the pictures of the lungs that have been, the stuff that's really supposed to make smoking really feel terrible to you, that's really like a revenue-less tax. So if, in fact, it's much more efficient than doing stuff with a tax for some reason, then perhaps it can dominate it. But basically, you're making the lives of smokers miserable and you're not generating revenues. Whereas you can do the same bloody thing with a tax and actually at least take in something. I guess the third point is that really, isn't there an implication that any institution that gets people's time, like universities, are going to find the urge to persuade almost unavoidable, right? That once you have actually the access to this, how are you going to avoid, trying to convince your students that giving money to your university is the best thing in the world that they could possibly do with their lives? Or if you're Gary Becker, convincing your students that actually spending a life in research in economics is the most amazing thing that could possibly be done. In that case, of course, he was right. And I guess finally, just the point in which we've disagreed somewhat on this is I do think that probably in the long run it makes sense to be somewhat more open to models of persuasion that actually have beliefs in them that are somewhat more Bayesian, in part because you get just a whole bunch of implications that come out of sort of assuming that this is actually a belief about a real thing rather than just a machine for moving demand.
I agree. I think I definitely agree with that, and I was talking with Amir about that the other day, and I kind of view some of the stuff that Amir and Matt have been doing as kind of complementary in that it addresses a very different aspect of the aspect of influence and persuasion. The other side that I didn't talk about earlier, and which is actually in the write-up that Gary and I have, is about this sort of leaning to being persuaded, that it really helps when the person is close, and this gets back to Scott's point, the person is close to the margin to begin with. That is, I'm already thinking about maybe giving money to my school, then persuasion becomes a lot more attractive. And if I'm right on the margin, it becomes extremely attractive. And that's really what drove the results I had. On that very continuous margin, it becomes extremely attractive, and infinitely attractive in some sense. And that, and that goes a little too far, but I think it's important. This also has implications for, like, the cost to consumers of not having good information. And the answer is, if it affects the price they pay, it has a big effect on their welfare. If it affects the quantities they buy, not too much, pretty small. And I think we sometimes forget that when we think about, first, what choices people will make, and often they won't want to become that informed. And number two, about how we assess the harm associated with people being poorly informed. And one question, big one, is how does it affect prices versus how does it affect quantities, because they're so different in terms of their welfare implications.
Thanks. That was really interesting, Kevin. I wanted to ask you a question that maybe takes you a little further away from your framework, at least as I understand it, to think about the dark side of persuasion. And what comes to my mind are institutions or social orders that are preserved in part because, think about an odious regime of some sort, a dictatorship, the institution of slavery, where persuasion or indoctrination is used partly as a device to preserve the right to continue to indoctrinate going forward. So I think of dictatorships as using this as a tool to maintain their power. And the use of persuasion in that context seems to have a much less pleasant set of implications than the contexts that you've emphasized here. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I would like to link that up to the difference between competition and monopoly and the impact of persuasion with competition and monopoly. It's actually more complicated. It's clear that monopoly persuasion doesn't have necessarily a lot of this. Remember, I talked about the ancillary benefits of the ability to be persuaded. With monopoly, a lot of that doesn't exist. On the cost side, though, it can go either way. That on the cost side, there can be impacts. There's this competitive benefit, but there's also this sort of, I'm pushing person out on my frontier, but maybe back on somebody else's, and that can mean that I'm overstating the gains from trade associated with that. I guess I would agree with yours, and this gets back, I think, to the point Ed made, that particularly if we put it in a social or political context of this network, that can even further enhance this notion that the levers you have on persuasion could be quite high. And I guess I share your concern that persuasion isn't always as positive as I make out. I don't want to say I make out as the examples that I talked about today, because actually in the paper we do talk a little bit about ones. And the other one is you don't necessarily have the ability to reject persuasion. It's not necessarily voluntary to undertake persuasion. And you might say, well, that's just another tax, but that's a tax they may be able to levy without the same marginal cost to them that they levy on taxes on other margins. So the ability to persuade people kind of enhances their tax base because they're able to, you have some convex cost of taxing people, say, explicitly on money. Well, now I got this other margin. I can tax them on the persuasion margin. So even though it is just another tax, even a totalitarian or other regime could take much greater advantage of that and increase the total tax burden on people. And it could be a tax burden that's borne on the kind of margins you talked about. Also, I mean, you got the indirect side of it I would really want to think about, which is if you're taxing people, if this gets back to my cronyism point, if you're restraining, say, people's ability to get information because you're afraid they're going to get some information that's harmful to you, that can impose lots of costs of people on other dimensions. I'd want to think about that too. So the same reason there's a spillover across good and bad activities, the ability, the desire to prevent people from doing what the government doesn't like could really squash their abilities to do things on other margins. So I know that's outside my model, but I clearly would think you'd want to think about that. All right.